Okay, it's 9 o'clock, and I promise everyone that we will try to start on time and before the football game. Faye, as my checker and editor and critic, we prepare before together, and we sit down afterwards, and she says, okay, David, you did this wrong, and you spelled that wrong, and so forth. And that's why I always tell an audience that if you're unhappy with anything, go to Faye. That having been said, Faye told me yesterday that she wanted to say a few words. So here's Faye.
So, at our first meeting...
Faye, pull the microphone closer to you.
Oh, okay. Ginny, I want to be able to see you right here. Okay. At our first meeting 2 weeks ago, a few of you mentioned that you have been in some of David's really old classes back around 30 years ago, 25 years ago, like Ginny and a few others of you. And it made immigrant experiences was one of the very first ones, or Race to the Poles, Longitude, or the Murrow Boys. So when we got back home 2 weeks ago, I asked David to make a list chronologically of all of the classes he has conceived and taught since Iliad began. We've never done this before. In 1993, 31 years ago. Well, he did, and here it is. That's 1/3 of it. Okay? That's what I said. Oh my God, really? So there's there are some that were very popular, like Darwin, Longitude, the Race to the Poles, David did many times, Darwin, the Brits in Africa, Fin de Siècle, Vienna, many of you were in that class. It's About Time, and The Lady in Gold. Conversation in Copenhagen, Transit of Venus, Johann Strauss, Family Music, that was done over Christmas time at the Hague. The Lure of Fascism, and today, whose land is it anyway? As you can see, he has been busy. Most of these on this list were 8-week classes, often with a movie in the afternoon. Sometimes we are able to arrange for the author of the book to come to class. In the early days, we often did get-to-know-you parties, some of you might remember, and before the first class, and then celebratory lunches after the first class, with a theme for the lunch from the class. Then there was the summer lecture series, which was David's idea, and he worked hard to convince the powers that be that it was a good idea for Iliad, for the Iliad community. It came into fruition in 1997 and has been going strong ever since, I am proud to say. Yes. I'm curious, how many of you that are here today have been in a class or lecture with David in the past? Oh, most of you. That's great. One thing is for certain, David would never have wanted to spend the enormous amount of time working on these courses for an uninvolved, unresponsive students. It is all of you, bright and curious people, who make it fun and worthwhile. Thank you. And thank you for being here. It's great to see you all, old friends and new friends.
That's it. Okay. Thanks. When I mentioned to one of you what the subject was going to be today, why have people hated the Jews? The comment was, you got to be kidding. You're going to talk about that? Well, that is critical, absolutely critical to the story that we're unfolding over these weeks, and critical to what you're reading in the newspapers every morning. Now, in review, there are some people who are new here this morning, and I welcome you who were not able to be here last week. And simply put, we first introduced...
I think the mic needs to turn.
So, 2 weeks ago, we've introduced the story of Abraham, which was 4,000 years ago, to whom God promised the land of Canaan. And then we moved through that story to the Romans driving the Jews out of the land of Canaan, leaving Masada and all of what was then the land of Canaan in 73 AD. And then that led to the dispersion of Jews across the world, but mainly around the Mediterranean. The map in front of you shows that. And then we went through the number of different peoples who controlled the land from 73 AD for almost 2,000 years, and you can see those names in front of you. So that's what we did 2 weeks ago. And then I mentioned to you the discovery doctrine and the fact that whoever lands first, if they're white and Christian and from Europe, you grab the land in your name. And Steve Flanders pointed out to me that I had forgotten to tell you that in 1493, Pope Alexander VI drew a line of demarcation across the world and divided South America into which part of South America will belong, from that point on, will belong to Spain, and which part of it will belong to Portugal. And this is a painting of Pope Alexander VI, and the map and the line called the line of demarcation, which was done in 1493 in a spirit of arrogance and haughtiness. If you're white and Christian and from Europe, you could divide up the land as you wished. This was at
that point, nobody even knew about South America.
Well, but they drew the line. I always have Steve Flanders to count on, and one of the better things he reminded me to do 2 weeks ago was to compare the landmass of Israel, today's Israel, to that of Vermont and New Hampshire. So I went back and did that, Steve, and here you see the comparison of Vermont, square miles, New Hampshire, and Israel. So the entire land of Israel is less than either Vermont or New Hampshire. But to give you an idea of how crowded it is in Gaza, about which you're reading, which is 140 square miles, essentially the same size as Nashua, New Hampshire, in that small area, there's a population of 2 million people. So does that do it, Steve? Okay. All right. So I'm now going to move on to the troublesome question of why people have hated the Jews. And again, I want to thank Doyle and Lohman, financial advisors here in Hanover, who have made, with their generous contribution, all of the booklets and the refreshments that you have and will enjoy at break time. So in order to answer this question, why have people hated Jews? There are a number of answers. It's not so simple, but there are answers. And they depend on who Jews are, what Jews believe, what Jews claim, and what Jews do. So let's take each of those so that we appreciate the whole story. 4 topics: who they are, what Jews believe, what Jews claim and what Jews do. Our challenge is to understand why a very tiny percentage of the people of the world, the Jews, have found themselves as a source of resentment and fear and a lightning rod for hatred in every culture in which they have lived. The underlying causative prelude to the trouble we see today between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Who are they? Fascists have accused them of being communists. Communists have branded them as capitalists. Poor Jews are bullied. Rich Jews are resented. Jews who live in non-Jewish societies have been accused of dual loyalties, while Jews who live in the Jewish state have been condemned as racists. They were, and they are today, an interrelated group. Today, approximately 14.5 million across the world. 14.5 million, who altogether trace their lineage back 4,000 years to the great-grandsons of Abraham. The grandson of Abraham, Jacob, is said to have had 12 sons, which, as the story goes, that group developed into 12 tribes. The tribes are thought to have been conquered, dispersed, and have essentially disappeared. 10 of them. 10 of those 12 have disappeared. The tribe of Levi became Jewish priests, without land, but a proud part of Jewish legacy. The tribe of Judah's descendants received the southern land of Canaan, the land of Judea. It is from this group that the Jews of today and Jesus descended. Faye and I have just come back from Cape Cod, where I did this in the condensed version this past week, and I was asked, where did the name Jews first arise? And the name, the people known as Jews arose from those who were then in Judea. That's from where the name came. The Jews of today they did make up 2% of the population of Europe prior to the Holocaust, 1939. The Jews of today make up 0.2% of the world population. You see how they disappeared in Europe from 2% to 0.2%. They make up 2% of the United States population and 0.2% of European population. Very simply put, how are Jews classified in terms of how they practice and what they believe? Basically, simply, there are 4 groups of Jews in this country and abroad: Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and Reconstructionist. So what do they believe that has caused the problems? That can be broken down into 3 categories. Their belief in how they believe about God, the laws which dictate their behaviors, and their concept of chosenness. What do they believe? Let's talk about first their concepts of God. And that can be broken down very clearly into the first 2,000 years and the second 2,000 years, and it's important to understand each and keep them separated. So let's talk about the first 2,000 years. Surrounded by pagan peoples 4,000 years ago, the Jews believed, and the pagans who believed in many gods, Abraham and his descendants set themselves apart for 2,000 years in this ancient world by embracing one God. One God for all of humankind. And additionally, the Jews claimed that the one God revealed himself through them, the Jews, and through them alone. Not unreasonable to believe that by outside standards, These folks, back from 4,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago, might have well been thought of by the pagans as haughty, arrogant, certainly committed, unwavering in the surety of their belief in one God. They were a threat to any group who had multiple gods. The American Indians, sun god, rain god, land god, etc. Abraham's God is invisible and unrepresentable. It's an idea, not an image. A power beyond imagination, handing down laws by which to live wholesome, healthy, productive lives. Very different than the pagan gods believed in by so many. It was understood from the very beginning that the Jewish God is universal, neither male nor female, and expects all its adherents to make it their life's work to repair the world, to make the world a better place for their having been here. The belief in this kind of unitary God with clear expectations expressed in written laws implied to everyone else in that Middle Eastern pagan world that if the Jews were right, their multiple gods demanding nothing but allegiance from their followers were just wrong-headed, illegitimate. For 2,000 years, until the rise of Christianity, the pagan-believing world was at war with the Jews and their claim of a unitary God over everyone. The pagan Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians hated the Jews, not because they were rich or successful or for any other reason, not directly related to their belief. Jews were rejected, hated, expelled, and murdered because they practiced Judaism. The Jews, with their surety of monotheistic belief, were an existentialist threat to the pagan world, with their cherished beliefs in multiple gods, up until the time of Jesus. The first expression, historically, of anti-Semitism, lasting 2,000 years, was a rebellion against Jews' belief in one God, a belief known as ethical monotheism. And then the birth of Christianity, and the second 2,000 years of Jew hatred. Jesus was thought to have been born in 4 BC, roughly, within a Jewish family. During the last 3 years of the 36 years of his life, he taught a concept of the kingdom of God as one full of love and forgiveness. He was thought to have performed miracles, healing the sick, and raising the dead. He died by crucifixion, murdered in the most inhumane manner possible by the pagan Romans between 30 and 33 AD. So great was the fear of rebellion and their hate for the young Jewish man who inspired others to forget the rigors of Jewish law and pagan beliefs of multiple gods by espousing a welcome concept of a single, although a trinity, loving and forgiving God. Now the second 2,000 years of Jew hatred. Those Jews who gave up Judaic belief to follow Jesus' teaching and spread his message were the originators of Christianity. In the Roman province of Judea in the 1st century CE. Their core beliefs: Jesus, God, salvation. Jesus. The Christians claimed that he was the Son of God, both fully human and fully divine. They believed that he rose from the dead, resurrected by God 3 days after his death. The Jews were complicit in his death. God, one God, but a Trinity, Son and Holy Spirit. He is perfect, omnipotent, everywhere having created and now maintaining the universe. The Christian God becomes known through prayer, worship, love, and mystical experiences. Then there was Jews' refusal to recognize Jesus as the Son of God. And salvation. Christians went on to believe that salvation, deliverance or redemption, the avoidance of a separation from God and going to hell, rather than going to heaven, comes from believing in Jesus, his teaching, and that he died and was resurrected to save men and women from their sins. Whether coming into a right and proper relationship with God is through good works, as espoused by the Roman Catholic Church, or through pure faith, the inability of people to earn salvation by their own good works, as preached by the Protestant led by Martin Luther. The concept of salvation is totally foreign to the Jewish community. Alternative view of sin, heaven, and hell. Obedience to the Pope. Fear of liberalism. Those who gave up their Judaism or rejected paganism and became Christians believe then and believe today that what their God demands is proper faith, and that this faith in the redemptive work of Jesus, once truly held, ensures eternal salvation. Those who became Christians believed that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God, here on earth. This contrasts deeply with Judaism, which has never embraced the idea that all of us, all of humanity, carry with us an inherited sin from Adam. Judaism talks not at all about original sin, but holds that one is put right with God through performing the good deeds dictated by Judaic law. Therein, that Jewish descent from the Christian Orthodox thought in the minds of Christians is a primordial Jewish crime. The Jewish belief in a single, unseen God was to early church fathers irreconcilable with an anathema to the idea of Christian faith, love, personal salvation, and an afterlife. Salvation in Judaism is tied to the concepts of ethical living and communal redemption. The Messiah will come one day and return all Jews to Israel and the rebuilding of the temple. The thinking leading to Jew hatred goes something like the following. If the small band of Jews looking to their monotheistic God and living by his laws are right, then all the rest of us believing in Christianity must be wrong. And we have wasted our lives being so devoted. That existential threat was enough reason right there for the desire to get rid of the Jews. They were a threat. While the responsibility for Jesus' death is complex, the antipathy, if not hatred of Jews, has been exacerbated by the Gospels of Matthew and John, which suggests that it was the Jews who killed the Son of God. Anti-Semitism has been made worse over the centuries by the argument that if the Jews were innocent of the death of Jesus, the Son of God, then the Gospel writers, Matthew and John, were guilty of a vicious slander, and that could just not be. The Jews must have done it. Now, from where do I get a lot of these thoughts in this information. As many of you may know, I've learned by doing these Iliad classes that nothing works so well as to find a good book and then get in touch with the author, try to meet the author or authors, and then invite them to Hanover. And I've done that repeatedly, and every time it works. It has never failed. Whether we did Longitude, or we did Edward R. Murrow, or we did Darwin, the author coming from England, when we've done it, everybody buys the book, they read it, and they meet the author signs the book, and we all have a good time and learn a lot. Well, 20 years ago, I must have somehow bought a book entitled Constantine's Sword. And it sat on my bookshelf for 20 years. And then after October 7th, with what happened in Gaza, I decided to really start reading a lot and see if I could put together this kind of a class. And I went to my bookshelves and found this book that I hadn't touched. How many have read Constantine's Sword? Okay, Joe and Dorothy. So I picked up this book, which is 630 pages, and Faye will tell you I read every page assiduously. I was blown away by the beautiful writing and by the erudition, how much this James Carroll knew and transmitted beautifully in this book. And so I said to Faye, this is so good, I'm learning so much. I'd like to meet this James Carroll. And so I said, Faye, as my researcher, could you find out how I get in touch with him, where he lives, whether he's still living, etc. So Faye did that. And she comes back very quickly. And she says, David, you're 85, he's 81. You guys would get along. Number two, of all places, he lives in Boston. I said, whoa. And how do you get in touch with him? Well, at the bottom of his website is a little note, his email address. So I wrote him a letter. And I said, dear Mr. Carroll, I've read your book. I'm doing this class. I'd like to come down to Boston and take you to lunch or dinner. I had no idea really to where the email went, Scribner's or the publisher, or who knows. It goes into the ether. And nothing happened. For 3 weeks, I didn't hear anything. And then all of a sudden, I ran into the kitchen telling Faye, Mr. Carroll has written me back. And he wrote me a very nice note, was interested what we were doing, and said that right now he doesn't have time to get together because he's so busy working on the campaign for Kamala Harris that he can't spare the time, but be in touch afterwards. So there's hope. Should you be interested, I can't recommend a book more highly, and it's in the booklet that you have under my suggested readings of James Carroll. He lives in Boston, 81 years old now. He wrote this 20 years ago. And the interesting thing about James Carroll is that he grew up in an absolutely rigid Catholic family. His mother was absolutely devoted to Catholicism, so much so that she took him as a young teenager to many of the Catholic places in Europe. And then he went into the priesthood, studied, and was ordained as a Catholic priest and practiced as a Catholic priest for 5 years, and then decided to rethink the whole thing and essentially spent the rest of his career writing, thinking, discussing, with much time spent at both the Kennedy School of Government and the Harvard School of Divinity. So he's very well worth reading, and maybe somehow if it happens and I am able to meet him and have lunch, I'll report back to all of you. Christian reasoning would deduce that if a person, a Jew, can achieve what Christians call salvation through good works, following Jewish law, but without acceptance of Jesus' divinity, then Christ would have died in vain. And if that is true, all Christianity teeters and falls. If Judaism is valid, then a priori Christianity is unnecessary, or at least raises questions about the basic tenets of Christianity. If what Jews believe is true, is a Christian life worth living? Or easier, more expedient, less theologically confrontational, to rid the world of Jews and Judaism? And then we don't have to consider this perplexing and troublesome question. For many of the early church fathers, for 2 centuries, this has been enough reason to hate those who undermined a basic belief. And indeed, until just some 60 years ago, in 1965, with Pope John leading the Catholic Church to officially adopt what has become known as Vatican II. That document, 1965, for the first time in 2,000 years, recognized both that Christians have a special relationship with Jews and the acknowledgement that the Jews are not guilty of killing Jesus. And further, and most significantly, vis-a-vis millennia of Jew hatred, the Jews' original covenant with God is still in effect. Herein, the disparity of belief, the threat to Christian doctrine, lies the origins of Christian theological anti-Semitism, the longest lasting Jew hatred in world history. And now what about Jewish laws? Is there something about Jewish laws that leads to people hating the Jews? Jews have lived by all-encompassing laws, rules, practices, ordinances, and commandments, expressed in detail in the Torah as moral laws laid down, they believe, by the one and only God. Jews' belief in living a life of repairing the world, guided with daily affirmation of a single God and denial of other gods, was a profound irritant to the ancient pagan world and unacceptable to the Christian world. Jewish law legislates for more than monotheism. The 613 laws ascribed in the Torah and the oral legal tradition, ultimately codified in the Talmud, legislate every aspect of Jewish life. The laws of monotheism required the Jews put their religious beliefs into practice. Christianity would say that their social values demand good works no less than Judaism. Social laws controlled ethical values, while laws controlling study, ritual, and sanctity resulted in the fact that Jews act, dress, and eat differently than their non-Jewish neighbors. Sabbath laws governing Saturday life ensured distinctiveness, separation, and resentment. Any group living so differently from the majority culture is bound to elicit lack of understanding and hostility. Easy to understand that they were seen and continue to be seen as the other. The world, since Talmudic times, has resented Jews for having introduced their type God and his laws and moral demands. It should be no surprise that a people practicing such different habits and holding fast to such different basic beliefs have been and are thought of and acted upon as a threat. Now, what about chosenness? And what does that create around the world for the Jews? The Jews claim to be and are known as the chosen people. That of all the nations in the world, God chose the Jews in a covenant to be his messengers to humankind. not superior, not privileged, but chosen, obligating them to live as a moral light unto the nations. And to that God's chosen people were additionally granted by God through Abraham a promised land. Chosen and promised and obligated. It is not difficult. It's not difficult at all to appreciate the hatred that people have had for Jews over 4,000 years, despite the fact that they were chosen, not for privileges, but for the obligation to be the light unto the nation. The fourth basic ingredient of anti-Semitism, what Jews do. And I want you to appreciate that this hatred of Jews, which is the longest running hatred of any group ever in the history of the world, had different reasons in different epochs of time. The first 2,000 years, pagan. The second 2,000 years, Christianity, and that which I've just described. And then the past 200 years. Not what Jews, who they are, or what they believe, or what they claim, but for the past 200 years, what they do. Before we go into what Jews do, let's take for a minute what Jews did not do, which caused huge suffering. What Jews did not do. Conspiracy theories. There always has to be somebody to blame when things go badly, whether a plague or a stock market crash. The 2% who thought differently, acted differently, prayed differently, were an easy target. And for most of history, the Jews were an easy target, accepting the outrage passively. Bad times for everyone have been particularly bad for the Jews. And the first I would mention as a notable conspiracy theory is labeled blood libel, which is a concocted story. The Jews kill Christian children in order to drink their blood and somehow obtain salvation. I'm not sure why, but that was the charge and the claim that Jewish people kill Christian children in order to drink their blood, as hard as that is for us to believe. Again, blame the other in conspiracy theories. Secondly is the Black Death. Now, I'm not sure how many of us appreciate the extent of what happened in Europe, during which, in Europe, due to what was called the Black Death, 25 million people died. 1/3 of Europe died due to this disease. When that kind of thing happens, you want to blame somebody. Somebody's got to be blamed for this absolute, utter catastrophe. Blame the other. Blame the other. This little 2% who think differently, act differently, pray differently. It was actually caused by a bacteria, Yersinia pestis, which is thought to have arrived in Europe aboard a boat that came in at the tip of Italy, at Sicily, at Messina, and the rats had fleas, and the rats came off the boats and spread through all of Europe, and 25 million people died due to this bacterium, which of course was not known in those days, and the Jews were blamed. And then the protocols of the elders of Zion. How many of you have ever heard of this? Okay. The protocols of the elders of Zion was a pamphlet, a book that was written in Russia in 1903 by people who were absolutely out to exterminate the Jews. The protocols were written, a book written and published in Russia in 1903 by a small group who hated Jews. It was a fabricated text, a literary forgery, written and published to look like a document that had been written by Jewish wise men, i.e., the wise men of Zion, espousing the intention of Jews to control the world's morals, banking, and press, and ultimately for the destruction of civilization. So the book was meant to look like it was written by Jewish wise men instructing the Jewish people in Europe to take over the world. And it was widely spread, the protocols of the elders of Zion. The protocols were translated into multiple languages and disseminated internationally. This booklet would prove to be the most influential work of anti-Semitism ever written, resulting in the Russian pogroms of the late 1800s, deaths of hundreds of thousands of Russian Jews, resulting in a mass exodus of Jews from the Pale of Settlement, which we'll talk about, to Palestine, and a standard text for German children starting in 1933. After Hitler became chancellor in 1933, every child in Germany in school was required to read the protocols of the elders of Zion, which led directly and understandably to the Holocaust and a further exodus from Europe, as we will see, to Palestine. Now, just for curiosity, since I appreciate that only a few of us have held this booklet in our hand and read it, I looked up Amazon. You can order it and have it in your mailbox in 2 days. It is easily and widely available. The protocols of the elders of Zion, it's still been reprinted multiple times, and it's written very convincingly, as if it were written by some wise Jewish men for distribution to the Jewish community on how Jews should take over the world. Towards the end of the 18th century, following the French Revolution, Catholic Christianity being challenged, the rise of the Enlightenment, Bacon, Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, Hume, Kant, Rousseau, Adam Smith, Jefferson, Voltaire, all those men that you and I read when we were in college. I'm not sure they're read anymore, but we read them. All those men, and the secularization of Europe following the Enlightenment, one would have expected a diminution in the hatred of Jews. Surprisingly, the Enlightenment during the 19th century did nothing of the kind. Jews remained the target. The reason for disliking the Jews changed. That's really a critical and a turning point in the reason the Jews were hated after the Enlightenment. Whereas during ancient times, anti-Semitism had everything to do with religion, in our modern secular age, for the past 200 years, and today, modern anti-Semitism has had little, if anything, to do with theology, and everything to do with what the world has seen Jews doing. Modern anti-Semitism. And what they have been doing is a lot more than dancing, although they do that too. Because Jews for centuries have believed that God made study a religious obligation. It is no surprise that intellectual achievement has been a hallmark of modern Jewish life. Well-educated, successful professionally, successful financially, charitable to those in need, and charitable of cultural endeavors, way beyond their tiny percent in the population. Jews across the past 2 centuries in the Western world have occupied more positions of leadership, writing more books, teaching and taking more classes, earning more degrees, winning more Nobel Prizes, composing more music, practicing more medicine, deciding more cases as jurists, occupying more positions in the learned professions, way more than their 2% in the general U.S. population and 0.2% in the world population would predict. The Jews have been rising for 2 centuries, and they have been disliked, if not worse, for what they have been doing. A small group of people with different fundamental beliefs, feeling different obligations, and living different lifestyles, achieving astounding success, rising in the face of the world, one comes to understand resentment, envy, exclusion, and much worse. Add to that different eating habits, praying differently, obeying different holidays, different expectations for education, expressing empathy for the plight of minorities, and sometimes looking differently. They are and have been the other. A tiny 2% of the U.S. population and 0.2% of Europe. The tiny percent who think differently, pray differently, act differently, and have been treated differently than 98% of the Christian world around them. Now, when I make up these slides, you'll see here that I have combined a background of Paris and a view of Johann Strauss from Vienna. And in past courses, many of you have been with me, where we spent our time talking about Vienna and we talked about Paris. So I'm going to share with you now what I call a tale of 2 cities. Not Dickens, London and Paris, but my story of 2 cities is Paris and Vienna. And by the time I finish with this, you'll understand why I pick Vienna and Paris. Vienna, 1867. Jews were welcomed to the Austro-Hungarian Empire from what are now 11 countries, coming from where they were restricted as to where they could live, excluded from education, limited as to whom they could marry, what land they could own, how they could make a living. In 1867, the laws were relaxed in Austria, and by the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, Jews were welcomed into essentially Vienna from what are now 11 countries, and they were free to flourish. The question is, what happened? Pre-modern religious hostility gave way to modern secular, social, and racial hostility, from religious hatred to racial disdain. Now not so much disliked by what they believe as to what they are doing. You know, Jews are thought of then, and to some extent now, Jews are thought of like salt in soup. A little salt is okay, but a lot, or too many, spoils the broth. Viennese anti-Semites, they were there at the turn of the century. Karl Lueger and George von Schonerer. And so was the young art student, at the same time, young Adolf Hitler. Non-Jews in the 19th century looked upon the majority of Jews as cowards. Powerless, these people who had streamed into Vienna not only looked funny, but they had no land, no state, no armies, no titled nobility, no apparent leaders. They just came. A segment of the Jewish people were hated for their apparent passivity, while at the same time other Jews were despised as either successful intellectual professionals or leaders of liberal causes. I'm using Vienna, with which I'm somewhat familiar, as an example of this story I'm going to tell you spread across Europe. But I'm going to tell the Viennese story, and you can extrapolate that to other cities as well. Reasons for anti-Semitism, and I'm choosing to tell the Viennese story. The Jews that streamed into Vienna from all the surrounding areas broke into essentially two groups. Those across the Danube in the suburb called Leopoldstadt, which is still there, looked pretty much like these. These are the Orthodox Jews who dressed funny, acted funny, looked funny. They were resented. And not just as many, but there was a significant group who had gone to school, became professionals. And they were at the Opera House, walking along the Ringstrasse, and they were very noticeable. And you had these two groups who looked nothing like each other, but they were both Jewish, with backgrounds that led either to looking like the Hasidic Jews on the right, or the well-financed, established, educated Jews on the left, here in front of the Vienna Opera House. Cultural interests in Vienna. Innovation, critical thinking, problem solving, creative and analytical skills, achievement, networking with each other, music, reading, writing, philosophy, an appreciation of history, science, medicine. They were embraced naturally and wholeheartedly. These funny-looking people went to school, wholeheartedly studying, enjoying, sharing, and practicing. They were not understood by most of the local population, contributing to the Jews being thought of in Vienna as the other. They were at the Opera House. They were in the music verein, and perhaps you visited Vienna and sat in this concert hall, which has the New Year's concerts every year. And then the economic factors which worked against the Jews being understood. And I think that this is one of the more interesting ways to understand the resentment that Jews experienced. Jews were never, and even today to a large extent, known for their artisan skills. There are not very many Jewish horseshoe makers, or Jewish guys who blow glass, or weave cloth, or do skills with their hands to any great extent. And that was true in Vienna, where these thousands of Jews came in. They weren't the artisans. They were the local Austrians with their skills. The Jews didn't have anything, hardly a place to live. So it was in this society in downtown Vienna, the Jews were known to take their cart. And they learned that with a push cart, they could walk out, or with a horse, walk out to the place where the guy made horseshoes, or somebody blew glass, or they did weaving, and pick up some of their goods and pull their cart to the other side of town where the guy had horses. And he could deliver the horseshoes and get paid, and would get paid more than what he paid for the horseshoes on this side of town. And they did it with glass, they did it with linens, they did it with everything they could think of. And the Jews became known as pushcart people. And as they went back and forth, they accumulated a good deal of money. But they had no skills other than pulling the pushcart and figuring out that they could buy low, sell high. And then what happened? While other people in town were at the Viennese coffee houses having their Kaffee mit Schlag and sitting reading the newspapers from across Europe, as you can still do today, these pushcart guys realized that they were wasting their time pushing their pushcart here and then taking their pushcart there and becoming somewhat wealthy. They could get the horseshoes delivered downtown and the linens and the glass and everything else delivered to them and set up a little cart in the middle of town. And the cart grew into a little store. and pretty soon a bigger store. And there you are. They were seen, and it's understandable that these artisans on the outskirts highly resented these uneducated Jewish people who were developing a department store with no artisan skills. And that caused resentment. Now I'll tell you, this is off the topic a little bit, but it's pretty close. Faye and I have an artist friend who lives in Rockport, Massachusetts. You know Rockport, just north of Boston, near Gloucester. Okay. And this guy's a really good artist. And Italian, he grew up in New York, and he does these paintings about so big. I happen to think they're beautiful. And he sells each painting for between $4,000 and $5,000 in Rockport, Mass, in his little studio. And we used to always go visit him, and he'd come up to Hanover, and we became very good friends. And I said, John, why don't you take your paintings and put them on Nantucket and Cape Cod and on Newbury Street in Boston and have a wider audience rather than sitting in Rockport waiting for a tourist to walk by your little gallery? And he said, David, I cannot stand the idea that I do this painting and then I give it to somebody who has a gallery and they just sit there and they charge the same $5,000 for the painting and they keep $2,500 and I keep $2,500 and this guy has no skills whatsoever. I just can't stand that idea. That says it all. That says it all of what happened, multiplied thousands of times in Europe during these years. I'm sure you understand. Music. Music is important in Vienna. Johann Strauss and others. And here you see Schoenberg with new kind of music, upsetting the world. And Gustav Mahler, who was conductor of the Viennese Symphony Orchestra, and in order to assume that position, had to, quote, give up his Judaism and convert to Catholicism in order to be hired to direct the symphony. And then Jewish values were different. They extended way beyond what would be normal in the population to appreciating the plight of minorities. And this photograph, which I found, I think I just had to share with you. Because here you see, at a State of the Union address, Obama, a minority president, hugging Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a Jew, while Steve Breyer looks on, and behind Steve Breyer, another minority, Sonia Sotomayor. I mean, nothing more could capture this plight of the minorities than this one quick photograph taken in the chamber of the House of Representatives. That is what played out in Vienna. That the Jews, as a very tiny minority, became socialists. They became liberals. They understood the plight of other minorities. And for this they were hated. How can you stand up for these despised minorities? But they did. And then philanthropy, community support, both the accumulation of considerable wealth and then the sharing of it with cultural organizations by Jews was certainly noticed, if not respected. Those nowhere near able to compete despised and hated those who seemed to set the standard so easily. And then go back to the Bible, Exodus and Leviticus, where it states unequivocally that it is a sin in the Christian eyes to loan money and receive interest. That which we take for granted every day. That was considered a sin within the past 200 years. And so there was a need for money. There was a need for finances. But the Jews did not feel as though they were held back from this admonition in the Bible, you don't lend money with interest. But there was a need for it, so the Jews stepped in and found that there was a whole field in which they could help society along, help their Christian neighbors by loaning them money. And they charge interest. And that is what happened, and they became known, filling this need, as swindlers, moneylenders. And it is no surprise that over in England, Shakespeare would understand and appreciate this and created the character of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. And this is from where that comes. And then they were, another cultural aspect of why they were hated is they went into the professions. They valued education. The rise of the Jews in the professions, medicine, law, journalism, writing, science. It should be noted that 25% of all Nobel Prizes have been won by 0.2% of the world's population. That is a staggering statistic for which Jews have been resented. And then physicians. I just show you 3 in Vienna as an example of Landsteiner, the Jew who discovered the blood groups, A, B, and O. Sigmund Freud, we all know, and Semmelweis, who discovered, against everybody's wishes, that it really was a good idea to wash your hands before going into the operating room and after delivering a baby. And he was hated for it, because he was upsetting the whole rigmarole of what was going at the Allgemeine Krankenhaus in Vienna. And he was thrown out of Vienna and went back to Budapest. But he was the father of alerting the world that it was really important for physicians to wash their hands. And now Viennese writers, and we're almost ready to complete the circle that I want to paint for you. These were the writers, the most famous writers at the turn of the century in Vienna, and of these writers, 6 of them were Jewish. And most importantly for our story is Theodor Herzl. Theodor Herzl was a journalist for a newspaper called the Neue Freie Presse. Jim Kenyon in the back, like Theodor Herzl. He was a journalist. You could call him an investigative journalist. And he heard that a trial was going to take place in Europe, in Paris. And so it is Theodor Herzl who is the tie between the two cities, the tale of two cities, Vienna and Paris. And then going on with what Jews do, political hatred. Christians across Europe developed an ideology of revenge and hatred against the many intellectual Jews who identify themselves with left-wing, liberal, socialist, communist, anarchist ideals, leading labor unions, if not becoming the leader of the Russian Bolshevik Revolution. Here, the Jew, Leon Trotsky, at whose hands many died. So I want to step aside for just a moment from this Eurocentric hatred, reason for hatred of Jews for what they do over the past 200 years, but how the Arab world looks at Jews then and now. And basically the hatred comes understandably from profound humiliation, which can be broken down into 2 large categories. Cultural inferiority, the lack of advancement in the Arabic world with regard to education, science, technology, diplomatic connections, which we'll see in the next class. They knew nothing about how to approach the people in London, the people in Washington and the White House, business and medicine, and the humiliation that the Arabs feel at their loss of 6 wars to the Israeli Defense Forces. So that's just another whole world of people who hate the Jews, but in this case, for what they didn't do, their lack of advancement. And then there is the whole story of racial hatred. Who the Jews were made to be. Even if they could, they were unwilling to sacrifice enough of their sense of separateness to comfortably fit in. but they cannot, and they are unwilling. Blood determines character, a thought that lies deep within European culture. Immutable characteristics, unchangeable Jewish essence. To be born a Jew, no other people talk, look, or think like they do. A cultural distinctness, threatening to those among whom Jews lived. They are perceived as arrogant, power-hungry. They push, shove, mock sacred traditions, employ a sardonic wit, make fun of themselves, have an intellectual arrogance. They are outsiders, scheming to undermine beliefs, society, and culture. This is the racial hatred. Jews cannot shake off their essence. It is who they are. And then finally, the final solution. The failure to gain admission to art school in Vienna. Young Adolf Hitler left Vienna. Although he lived and was supported by a Jewish family through his teenage years in Vienna, he was turned down by the Art Academy as not sufficiently talented. And while in Vienna, trying to get into the art school and living with a Jewish family, he observed the two anti-Semites, Karl Lueger and George von Schonerer. This was political opportunism based on racial hatred. Hitler's hatred of Jews was rooted in a mix of personal, ideological, historical, and political factors. He embraced pseudoscientific racial theories that depicted Jews as a corrupting and dangerous force to fit his own agenda. Hitler used anti-Semitism as a political tool to unify and mobilize his followers, blaming Jews as a scapegoat for Germany's problems after the First World War, including its defeat in that war and the economic difficulties which followed. We've got to blame somebody. His racial hatred of Jews served to galvanize support for his Nazi party and distract them from the real issues. Hitler and the Nazis embraced and spread the propagated conspiracy theories of the protocols of the elders of Zion. Jews are involved in a global plot to control governments and economies. Anti-Semitism was used by Hitler to unify and distract the German population. And then I don't think there's any event which has caused more people around the world right today to hate the Jews than what they see unfolding in Gaza and the West Bank. We read about this, we see it on our cell phones, we see it on our computers, we read it in the newspapers. The profound destruction. And I think that you see this playing out on college campuses right here at Dartmouth and across the country in Europe. I don't think nowhere and never before have so many people, without reasoning it through, have, quote, hated the Jews. And I just read, was it yesterday, that red paint was on the president's office, on President Bylock's office? Yeah. Never have so many people around the world hated the Jews. So with that uplifting comment, let's take a break. Are we okay, Faye?
Yes, everything's
all right, so you have for your enjoyment bagels, lox, and cream cheese, and a Palestinian breakfast treat. So enjoy. Come on back about a half hour. Ginia Allison, one of the founders of Iliad in 1990, has asked to say a few words.
I know many of you have been talking about the courses that we all shared and delighted in, and I was so thrilled to see that list. I kept thinking, what was my favorite? And then, of course, the fact that we dressed up often at the conclusion and did a little acting, and it was, I'm seeing people nodding with delight. It was wonderful. So, I just thought that David or Faye going through all that David did was simply superb. But you know, something was omitted. the power behind the throne. That is Faye.
Oh, gosh.
On so many occasions, Faye was the one who had all the printed material for us, all the books, any visuals we needed. There she was, taking charge of everything, but only in the most quiet, graceful way. And then, of course, we had wonderful snacks before, after, parties later. It was terrific. So I ask you once again to applaud Faye for all she did.
Yes, thank you, Faye, and those of you who may have been there, may not. Back in the old days, from 93 maybe, for 10 or 12 years, we always had a get-together of everybody before the class. We had a before-the-class party, whether it was at our home or at the Rockefeller Center, and then invariably we'd have an after-class luncheon, whether at the Canoe Club or any other place. So we would be preceded by a party class where we all got to know each other, and then a luncheon after the last of the 8 classes. Lisa, you share what we're doing.
Yep. So just so you know, JAM is recording all of these sessions, and they're being edited and then added to YouTube. The first week of David's lecture is online, so what my plan is once they're edited and online, I will send them to everybody that's registering the class in case that you've missed the course or the class, or you would just like to review it. So if you don't get it, you know my number, and you know my email, so just call me. But that is my plan. I'm actually going to go clean, tidy up the food, and there are to-go boxes, so please help yourself when you leave. Take some treats, because there is some food left over. But after I do that, I will send to everybody the link from last week's, or 2 weeks ago, your first talk. And there is no class next week?
No,
right?
2 weeks.
2 weeks, so we'll see you in 2 weeks, and I'll maybe send a reminder out. But thank you, and I'll turn it back to David.
Thank you. Give me a second.
In addition to which, there are recipes here to make the Palestinian breakfast treat. So they're here if you wish them.
Anybody wants one?
When Lisa said they video record them and then they edit them, it would be good if the editing were such that they could erase the mistakes I've made. That's not what the editing has done. In order for you to see the slides more easily, I send a memory stick with all the slides to the video recorders, and then they insert the slides separately into the video recording. So they don't have to worry about taking a picture of that screen. The slide, they edit into the video recording so you see it on the whole screen in full. Now, one of the pleasures of doing this kind of class with this wonderful kind of group, which we've been doing for 31 years, is people have no reticence in walking up to me and tell me what I got wrong. And that's really good. That's how I get it. I try to get it right. So the most recent correction was in this slide. And one of you walked up to me and said, David, it was not Pope John Paul, it was Pope John, who in 1965 reversed Christian antagonism towards Jews. So please accept my correction. I've corrected the slide. It's Pope John, not Pope John Paul. Okay. So now the next step in the story, can you hear me if I walk away? You can see, okay. The next step in my plan was first to share with you the first week who was there in this land for 2,000 years and the fact that they were forced out, the Jews in 73 AD, and the Romans came in. And the Jews were dispersed across the world, but primarily in Europe and around the Mediterranean. This morning's presentation so far is given the reasons, after a fair amount of reading, why these people were hated. And I hope I've been able to do that in an informative, fair manner. And it occurred to me a couple of years ago when Faye and I were on the Cape looking at houses, and we mentioned that we might be interested in a house in this particular village on the Cape, and people said, well, there are no Jews in that village. None. There never have been, and there still are none. And of course, the country clubs that are there, no Jews. And so I started thinking, why? What's wrong with us? Why are there no Jews in certain areas? So I hope what I did in the first hour and a half brings some light as to why. What I'm now going to do is share with you, because of the hatred which has gone on for 2,000 years, the facts of the Jews having to flee. If you're going to be murdered or forced to convert to some other religion or leave. And that's essentially been the story. And these are an appreciation of these facts, just the facts. So nothing could wake you up more than Sergeant Joe Friday. Does this?
The story we're about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
So my purpose in sharing Joe Friday and Dragnet with you is for you to appreciate just the facts. And then we'll see what is a result of just the facts of which some of us may not be completely aware. Reading James Carroll's book, Constantine's Sword, one becomes acutely aware that Christianity came to Europe and essentially in the years 300. Close to 300 years after the life of Jesus, when the Emperor Constantine of Rome, after his countrymen forced the Jews to flee from Palestine, from the land of Canaan, it was Constantine who spread Christianity across the land of Europe. And here, amazingly, I found is a basilica that was built in roughly the year 300. That's a long time ago. And look at the construction of what they knew how to do to embrace Christianity under the Roman Emperor Constantine. Now, during the 500 years, Muhammad, which we'll see shortly, was recognized as the prophet for the Arab Muslims in roughly the year 600. There was no Islam before the year 600. That was 300 years after Constantine introduced Christianity to Europe. During the 500 years after Muhammad, get this straight now, Constantine is 300, Muhammad is roughly 600, and in the 500 years after Muhammad, up to roughly 1100, Islam, as well as Christianity due to Constantine's efforts, spread rapidly by war and conviction across the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. Christianity having gotten a head start 600 years before. Christian Latin Church, after centuries of Muslim wars of expansion, developed the aim and the conviction to kill all Muslims and rid Europe of Muslims from France and Germany all the way to Jerusalem. And these were called the Crusades. The primary objective was to wipe out this new religion of Islam and leave Europe with just Christianity. And if there were a scattering of Jews, so be it. We can kill them along the way in our path. Over here? Okay. We can kill the Jews if necessary. Our main aim is the Muslims and wipe out this religion of Islam across Europe. And here are some paintings of the Crusades, which all of us have heard about, but about which most of us know actually very little. And James Carroll does a beautiful job of explaining all this. In these roughly 300 years of journey, it started in the Rhineland, the same land where Hitler took over, but also in France, and spread. The march by thousands of these Christians were marching across Europe all the way down to Jerusalem and killing Muslims and Jews. And of course there were no photographs, but we learn what we can from the paintings that depict what was going on. And here is a map of the Crusades between 1095 and 1291. And then the need to flee or be forced out or be killed. In medieval England, there was an infamous murder of Jews in Norwich. Interesting, Norwich. I don't know how many of you have been to Norwich, England?
Norwich.
Norwich, sorry. Okay. In Norwich, Norwich is just a stone's throw from Cambridge, the University of Cambridge. And when Faye and I were there some years ago, it was easy to get in the car and just go out and see this small village of Norwich. And in Norwich, there was an infamous murder of Jews because they were Jews. King James I had wanted to be allowed by Parliament to tax the English population in order to afford a war against France. In exchange, on July 18th, 1290, the king agreed to expel the entire Jewish population living in England, which numbered 3,000, in order to compromise with the legislature. They were kicked out, every Jew, in 1290, and no Jews were allowed to live in England for 350 years. In France, between 1306 and 1394, essentially 90 years and 3 kings, all Jews were expelled by these 3 kings. They had to flee, convert, or be murdered. In Hungary, between 1345 and 1360, the same thing under these 3 kings. For more details, it's very easy to go to Wikipedia or any other source and look up these stories, and you'll see what I've found. In Austria, throughout the medieval period, Jews in Austria experienced a series of expulsions, economic restrictions, and violent attacks. In Germany, in medieval Germany, Jews faced significant challenges, including economic exploitation, religious discrimination, and periodic violence. In Lithuania, for approximately 50 years, although that country did not seem to see the same level of intense anti-Semitic persecution as other European regions, Jews still face restrictions and periodic tensions. And here's a map of the medieval expulsion of Jews from Central Europe. They were fleeing to try to find some place on earth where they would be safe. Bohemia and Moravia, more recently, in the 1700s, found the same thing: convert, leave, or be murdered. And then Spain. This was the turning point. 1492, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. I don't know whether you remember. I remember very well when I was in, I guess, grade school. We all learned the ditty. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. How many of you remember that? I mean, it didn't make any difference whether you were living in the Bronx or Hanover or California or St. Louis or anywhere else. I think every kid in America learned this ditty. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And that's what I thought I needed to know about Spain. Well, it turns out that there's more to that story than Columbus sailing the ocean blue. On March 31st, 1492, issued by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, was the Alhambra Decree, which stated that all Jews must be convert, leave, or be killed. That also involved the lands surrounding Spain under the control of Spain, including Portugal and parts of Italy. The ditty should have been written something like this. In 1492, convert, leave, or be killed because you're a Jew. That would have gotten everybody's attention. Between 200,000 to 300,000 Jews were forced to leave Spain. Many fled to various cities in Europe, most notably Amsterdam, but also to North Africa and parts of the Ottoman Empire. Some converted to Christianity and stayed, while those who remained and did not convert were put to death. In Portugal, the same, known as the Portuguese Inquisition, under Kings Manuel and John III. When one visits Europe today, and one goes to visit Amsterdam, it is an often visited site, what's known as the Sephardic Synagogue in Amsterdam, of which this is a, I guess a lithograph, is that what, an etching of the Sephardic Synagogue. But one doesn't have to take an etching to see the evidence of the Jews fleeing. Here's the reality when you walk in. This is the Sephardic synagogue that was built by the Spaniards and the Portuguese in Amsterdam because they were forced to either convert, be killed, or leave. And many left and built this synagogue in downtown Amsterdam, which is there today. And here's another picture of it. And so what did this leaving look like from the Spanish Sephardic world? The Jews in Spain and Portugal were forced to leave. And these arrows give you some indication of where they went. They spread across North Africa, not unexpectedly, many others to Amsterdam, and you see towards the Ottoman Empire. The Jews who left Spain and Portugal and settled in the areas that I'm showing you have since been known as Sephardic Jews, i.e. from Spain and Portugal, as against another group I'll show you later. But again, these Jews were trying to find some place on earth that they could live in peace and still practice their religion, which was 3,500 years old. Now, in Germany, in the modern era, 1830 to 1850, the combination of legal discrimination, violence, economic hardship, and the pursuit of better opportunities drove many Jews to emigrate from Germany during the 1830s to 1850s. The large group of Germans left for America between this time. It is not surprising, knowing what they had learned and what they had practiced in Europe, i.e. Vienna, that those from Germany were very well adept and skilled in commerce, in trade. So it's no surprise that after having stores, which I depicted to you as typical in Vienna, stores in the United States, mainly based first in New York, include Macy's, Bloomingdale's, Saks Fifth Avenue, and Lord & Taylor, were all begun by German Jews who were escaping Germany, came to America, and began with these little stores, which grew into the department stores that we easily recognize. Now that was Germany, but what about Russia? Russian folks were forced to live in an area which was called the Pale of Settlement. Now what the hell is the Pale, or was the Pale of Settlement? It was an area in Russia in which Jews were forced to live, and if they didn't choose to live there, they were killed, summarily killed. And so what did that area look like? Well, actually, it was a fairly large area, but it was an encompassed area of which you see here in Europe, a map of Europe, and here is a closer up view of it, which you see includes the Ukraine, Moldova, Lithuania, and a bit of Poland and Belarus extending up into Latvia. It was in this area that if you were Jewish and lived in Russia, you were forced to live. We are now talking about the mid-1800s. And it is no surprise when, I've always been amused by this, that when I meet some other Jewish person, they say, well, where are your folks from? Well, either they're from Germany or from Russia. There's just that's it. And if they're from Russia, they say, oh, well, what area? And isn't that interesting that your folks and my folks live so close together? Well, duh. That's where all Jews in Russia lived, in this area. And it was after 1880 that they were able to leave. And now let's look at why they were fleeing this area called the Pale of Settlement. The assassination of Tsar Alexander II in St. Petersburg in 1881 by a small group of Russian revolutionaries triggered a surge of anti-Semitic actions accusing the Jewish population of complicity in the Tsar's death. Following Tsar Alexander in 1881, Tsar Alexander III encouraged violent attacks against the Jewish community, including raping and massacres across the area where Jews lived, i.e. in the Pale of Settlement, between 1880 and the early 1900s. These attacks by official Russian troops were known as pogroms. No Jews were safe. There was a massive exodus running to go anywhere to get out of there that would have them. The majority coming to the United States. Between 1880 and 1920, the American Jewish population grew from 250,000 to 4 million, most of them from the area from Russia, from the Pale of Settlement, from where they had been forced to live by the czars. Those who chose not to make the 6,000-mile transatlantic trip to the United States, some hundreds, chose not to go across the Atlantic Ocean. They boarded ships for the much shorter trip to Palestine. After all, the land of Canaan, Palestine, was their land from 4000 BC to 73 AD when they were forced out by the Romans. Now they're forced out by the Russians, and they had no place to go. They were welcomed during those years, between 1880 and 1920 in the United States. And that group of immigrants forms the majority of descendants or antecedents of the folks, the Jewish folks that you know in Hanover and elsewhere, with a much smaller spattering of German Jews. What did the pogroms look like? Well, by the time they were occurring, George Eastman in Rochester, New York, had figured out how to make a box camera and film in Rochester, New York. The reason I know this, I worked for Eastman Kodak for a bit after college. Do you know why it became known as Kodak? The little box camera, which most of us had, a little black box camera that you pushed a button down to take a picture, it went Kodak as you push that button, and voila, you had a picture from Rochester, New York. And so that ability to snap a picture, thanks to George Eastman, allowed us to have a glimpse of what this horror looked like in Russia. These are all taken from the Pale of Settlement. The Russians moved in, massacres, torture, murder, rape in the pogroms. The people there were desperate to go anywhere, just get the hell out of there, and flee to any place that would have them. Here's some more pictures. Kodak film doesn't lie. This is what the horror looked like. And only because these people, the only crime they had committed was they were Jewish. In addition to the Jews, the majority of whom came to the United States, which at that time opened their doors, and these Jews easily entered the United States, they also went the much shorter route to Palestine. And here are a few photographs taken in Palestine of these people all too happy to get the hell out of the Pale of Settlement, and they chose to go to Palestine. I mean, look at this, walking through the fields carrying a Torah. And ships arrived, carrying the people to the port of Haifa, where they had hoped to begin a new life. Now, in telling this story, I want to do this very quickly, but I need to share with you three infamous trials, one of which has direct bearing on our story. The three trials are that of Leo Frank in Atlanta, Georgia, Alfred Dreyfus in Paris, and Menachem Bilas, 1911, in Kiev, the Ukraine. Menachem Mendel Bilas was the father of 5 children in Kiev. He worked as a superintendent at a brick factory. It turns out that a young boy disappeared and was found to be murdered. There was testimony that came forward that he had been kidnapped by a Jew. A report was submitted to the Tsar that the Jew Bilas was the murderer of the young boy. Bilas spent more than 2 years in prison, while an anti-Semitic campaign was launched in the Russian press against the entire Jewish community. It was only they who would be guilty of doing something like this. The trial took place in Kiev from September 25th to October 28th. The Lithuanian Catholic priest, well known for his hatred of Jews, testified that the murder by Bilos was one of blood libel. The kid was killed so the Christians could drink his blood. While Bilos was eventually exonerated, his 2 years of incarceration was emblematic of the pervasive hatred of Jews in the Ukraine. And it is not without mixed emotions that Jews across this country watch the events now unfolding in the Ukraine with vivid memories that life wasn't so great in the Ukraine for the Jews who live there. The Bilos affair and the Russian pogroms were a wake-up call to the Jews within the Pale of Settlement that they must run for their lives, whether to Palestine or to America. The second case, about which I'll tell you very, very quickly, is the Leo Frank case in Atlanta, Georgia. Very quickly, I did this in class some years ago. Leo Frank was a young man who grew up in New York and went up to some place called Ithaca, New York. George, where's George? He went up to Ithaca, New York, and attended Cornell University. He graduated on the shores of Lake Cayuga, and here you see Ithaca. Graduating with an engineering degree from Cornell, he looked for a job. And he found a job being offered, and he accepted it, in Atlanta, Georgia, working for a pencil factory where they made pencils. So Leo Frank took his love, Lucille, and they moved from New York with his Cornell engineering degree to become the superintendent of a pencil factory in Atlanta. And here's a picture of the pencil factory, and here's a picture of the Jew boy from New York who looked a little bit like a nerd, who had a degree from some college that most people down south knew nothing about, called Cornell. He took the job, he and his wife found a house in Atlanta, and not too long afterwards, on April 26, 1913, a young girl, and most of the employees in the pencil factory were young kids who worked at these long tables making pencils. A young girl by the name of Mary Fagan was found murdered and raped in the basement of the pencil factory. Well, you tell me what ensued. What ensued after finding the mutilated, raped body of this 12-year-old girl, Mary Fagan, in Atlanta, Georgia, the charge against Leo Frank very quickly followed, that there could be only one person who would be guilty of such a thing, and it must be the one Jew boy from the north who murdered and raped this 12-year-old young lady who worked in the pencil factory. And of course the charges were enlarged upon by Herbert Clay, who lived in Marietta, Georgia, just north of Atlanta, who was head of the Ku Klux Klan. The real culprit was the janitor, Jim Conley. But the hatred and discrimination against Jews was greater than that against the black population in Atlanta. And so, summarily, Leo Frank was found guilty, sentenced to death, and sent to a prison in South Georgia. I'm making the story very quick. There's a very poignant story which follows that having to do with the governor of Georgia, who was considering commuting the sentence of this young Jewish boy from Cornell who was wrongfully convicted of the crime. He was sitting in a jail in Valdosta, Georgia, South Georgia, near the Florida line, when the governor was thinking about commuting his sentence. In the middle of the night, the Ku Klux Klan left from Marietta, Georgia, drove maybe 160 miles or so, down to Valdosta, grabbed the boy out of the jail, brought him back to Atlanta, and here he is hung. That's the second trial that has burned into the memory of the Jewish population. But there was a greater, one more significant, which completes my tie, which I'm trying to create for you, between Vienna and Paris. Here's Theodor Herzl. He's in Vienna. He's an investigative journalist for the liberal newspaper in Vienna, the Neue Freie Presse. And he is the tie, the critical tie, in this story which relates to this morning what's happening in Gaza. How so? In 1893, a young man not so different than Leo Frank from New York and Cornell, by the name of Alfred Dreyfus, who grew up in the area of France called Alsace-Lorraine, decided, unlike most of his friends, to go to the military academy in Paris. So his parents said, if that's what you want to do, you should do it. And so Alfred Dreyfus, undoubtedly a nerdy-looking Jewish kid from Alsace-Lorraine, went to Paris, went to the École Militaire, and graduated at the very near top of his class. He then became an officer. I'm making the story really short. He then became an officer, was commissioned as an officer in the French army, and very proud to be so. When it was discovered that some French documents had been fed to the German embassy, giving French military secrets to the Germans. Well, who else would do such a crime but this nerdy-looking Jewish kid who did all too well in school, and that kind of a kid never belonged in the military school anyway. So Alfred Dreyfus was put on trial. Theodor Herzl in Vienna heard of this and said, I must cover this trial. He travels from Vienna to Paris and sits in the courtroom taking notes on every word that transpired when Alfred Dreyfus was at court-martial. Alfred Dreyfus was stripped of his commission. His epaulets were torn off his jacket. He went through 2 court-martials, found guilty at both, and was sentenced to years on a hellhole island off the coast of South America, which France controlled, called Devil's Island. It was Theodor Herzl who covered this trial and wrote about it for the Neue Freie Presse back in Vienna. But Theodor Herzl started scratching his head and saying to himself, if Jews are not safe in Paris, for God's sakes, the land of equality, fraternity, liberty, where are they safe? They've run from Russia, they've run from Spain, they've run from Portugal, they've run from France, they've run from Lithuania, and now a totally legitimate star pupil is court-martialed and sent to this island because he was Jewish. Jews, so concludes Theodor Herzl, are not safe anywhere. They need a place to flee where they can be safe. And so Theodor Herzl sits down and writes a book called Der Judenstaat, which translated means the Jewish state. At the time that he was put on trial, Paris was split 50-50 between those who were Dreyfusards and those who were anti-Dreyfusards. Just as our country is split between red America and blue America. And if you read about France during this time, everybody was either for Dreyfus or against Dreyfus. And you will be saddened and perhaps shocked to learn that there's those, many of whom we emulate, such as Edward Degas. We go down to Boston, the MFA, and wonder at his paintings. Renoir and his paintings, and many others were absolutely convinced that it must be that Alfred Dreyfus was guilty and sold secrets to the Germans. The one voice in the wilderness was Emil Zola, and you can read his story. I can only mention his name, who came out in favor of the terrible crime that was going on in accusing Alfred Dreyfus, and he had to escape with his life to London. He left in the dark of night and got himself out of Paris to London. And this is the book, Der Judenstaat, which Theodor Herzl wrote, concluding that there is no place in Europe or anywhere else where Jews can be assured of safety other than their original home, the land of Canaan. And so he convinced of this, because if it could happen in Paris, it could and was and is happening across the world. The Jews must create their own state. And wondering where that should be, he called a Zionist Congress, which was known as the First Zionist Congress, which met in Basel, Switzerland in 1896, at which a discussion was taken up as to where the Jews should form their state. Just as you can order the Protocols of the Elders of Zion on Amazon, so can you order Der Judenstaat. And it'll be at your front door in 2 days also. It's not a big book, but you can read all the reasoning by Theodor Herzl of why the Jews needed their own state. They looked at places. They looked at Argentina. They looked at Uganda. They looked at many places, and none of them seemed quite as right as the land from which they had been forced to flee in 73 AD. So a vote was taken, and that is why Theodor Herzl is known as the father of Zionism. Anti-Semitism wasn't just in Europe. The Gilded Age in America. In the 20th century, exclusionary practices against Jews here were prevalent in social spheres, including country clubs, social clubs, the banking, and the corporate world. Restrictive membership policies, commonly referred to as gentlemen's agreements, that excluded Jews and other minorities, were the rule of the social game. These clubs maintained an unwritten policy of admitting only individuals from specific backgrounds, ethnicities, and religions. The term WASP gained prominence in the early to mid-20th century and was used, usually pejoratively, to describe the dominant social elite, those associated with wealth, social status, and influence in American society. This exclusion had widespread social and economic implications, limiting opportunities for Jewish individuals to network, access influential circles, entertain certain professions, and advance their careers. Meanwhile, in Europe, between World War I and World War II, there was blatant anti-Semitic discrimination. And let me give you a few photographs of what it looked like to be Jewish in Europe between the two world wars. The Yellow Star of David, Judah. In order to graduate at a university in Europe, you could receive your diploma, but you had to be rightfully identified as Jewish. Weddings It was okay to have a Jewish wedding in Europe, but both the bride and groom must wear a yellow star. And then it was a short road from having to wear the Star of David in Europe to being forced to live in a ghetto. And here's a group being loaded into the wagon and taken to a ghetto. This was life in Europe because you were Jewish. The huddled masses yearning to get out, to have some place to go. More. And it was a short road from ghettos to concentration camps because you were Jewish. And it was a short road from concentration camps to gas ovens. The Jews in Europe were a race to be exterminated. There was a Jewish problem, as it was perceived in Germany, the Jewish problem. Because in Europe there were 9.5 million Jews. And it was thought that we need to get rid of these troublemakers. So on 20th of January 1942, Hitler convened a group in this building in a suburb of Berlin, which Mort Wise was just there last week or 2 weeks ago, called Wannsee. You can walk into this room where this picture was taken, where plans were made for the final solution. All of this needs to end. We just need to kill every Jew in Europe, and then we can have peace. And this is where the vote was taken, and all the plans for the concentration camps were put together. Coming back to my Vienna, 65,000 Jews were sent from the Ringstrasse in Vienna directly to Auschwitz and never heard from again. It turns out that 6 million Jews of the 9.5 million were gassed and burned in Auschwitz. The American troops discovered the horrible fact. It turns out at the end of the war, May 8th, 1945, the war was over. But there were 3.5 million Jews who survived. Of the 9.5, there were now 3.5 million Jews left. And they had no place to go. They needed to get out. In addition to Europe, every country in the Middle East told the Jews, get out now. We'll open the doors and you need to leave because you're no longer welcome in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, Yemen, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria. The doors are open. You're no longer welcome here. So the next class in 2 weeks will be the need to flee, to find some place on earth. And so in 2 weeks, or the reason we're not meeting here next week is because the medical school needs this room on Saturday morning. So beggars can only be choosers. Choosers can only be beggars or something like that. And so we'll meet in 2 weeks. One of you walked up to me and asked me, why is it that there are 5 weeks and you're only lecturing on the first 4 weeks? You should know that the plan is that on the 5th week, we will be joined by a Palestinian. The Palestinian is a young man whom I met in Hanover 8 years ago. He turned out to be a remarkable individual. Trust me, he's a really, really, really wonderful guy. He's from the West Bank, and I'll tell you more as time goes on. He's now at Columbia University, having spent 8 years here in Hanover. He's working towards his philosophy degree. He's, I guess, now going on 36 years old. He wants to bring peace to the Middle East. His name is Mosen. Many of you met him in my class when we did The World of Yesterday. He spoke. And he's had a stellar career ever since that time. And so on the 5th Saturday morning, God willing, Mosen will be here. He will have the stage and tell you from his perspective what the hell life is like in Palestine and the West Bank, from which he escaped by going over the wall. So thank you for attending. Have a good weekend, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.